Welcome to another Photography Simplified video. My name is Chris, and in these videos, I do my best to simplify photography for you with the goal of helping you to get out and take great photos. Today, we're talking all about editing or post-processing and what to do with your images after you've taken them. More than anything, we'll walk through some specific examples of how I edit my photos to give you a good idea of what you can do with yours. Now, keep in mind that there's no exact science to how to edit your images. A lot of it's going to be your own personal preference or your style on how you like to edit your images. But the examples in today's video will help you to get a general idea of how you could process an image file. Now, when I edit my images, I like to keep it simple. I first do global edits, meaning I adjust the entire image where things need to be adjusted. Usually these are pretty minimal. And then I do the majority of the work in local edits or adjustments, meaning I edit areas specifically and adjust the things that those areas need. Local edits are done using masks. Masks are tools in Lightroom that help you select specific or certain areas of your image. Now, let's dive into the examples and see how this works. Okay, before we jump into any examples, I wanted to briefly just touch on file organization. This is something that I struggled with as a beginner, and it's gotten easier over time, but it took me a little bit to develop a method, so I just briefly wanted to show how I organize my files to make it easy so I can find things, come back to them, and so on. And so what I like to do is I create folders for the different years. So in this case, I'm already in a folder for 2023. And as I go to different locations, I create a folder for each location. And then within that folder, I create another folder where I store all of my raw and unedited files. So you can see here's all my raw photos. And then in the overarching folder for whatever the location is, in this case Lake Blanche, this is where I end up exporting all of my final and finished edits. All right, so let's jump into this first example. And remember, if you end up finding this video helpful, please leave a like and subscribe so you can see my other beginner tutorials as well. Now, when I'm editing a photo, what I like to do is just go through each panel one by one from top to bottom. And this is a pretty good and simple process to go through and edit my photos. It makes it simple and easy, and you may not need to tweak everything. There might be certain panels or sliders you don't use at all, but that just helps me to cover all the bases when editing my photos. So the very first thing that I would recommend doing if you're shooting landscape photography like I am, is I change my color profile from Adobe Color to Adobe Landscape. And you can see that that just makes the colors a little more contrasty, makes them pop a little more. If you were shooting portraits, you could change it to Adobe Portrait, or really any of these, depending on the style you're going for. But that's a good place for me to start. Then from there, before I do any edits, I like to go to my crop, and if I need to, I can straighten a horizon. If it's crooked, I can get the crop I want if I want to change or take something out. In this case, I'm not going to change anything, and so I'm just going to leave that as is. And now from there, we're just going to work through these sliders. And remember, I try to do all of my global edits first, meaning adjustments to the whole photo, and then I'll go and do some masking and adjustments to specific areas. Now, one thing that's helpful to know is you can use your sliders to see the kind of range and options that you have. For example, I can see here my sky is a little blown out. So if I just drag my exposure down, I can see, okay, I can bring back a lot of that. Or similarly, I could do that with my highlights. I can also see that the foreground's a little dark. So what if I increased my shadows or exposure? I can see that there's a lot of wiggle room there, and this just helps me to know more or less what I can and can't save and how much I can play with things. So as I mentioned, let's just start at the top and go down. As far as global edits, I try to keep these pretty minimal, but let's add a little bit of exposure to this, maybe a little bit of contrast, and let's bring our highlights down a bit. Not too much, because really we want those down in the sky, but everywhere else they're pretty okay. And then I like to increase the whites a little bit, add some contrast, and that's probably good for that. I'm not going to do too much more. Now, color, you can really change a lot here, and you can also really make your photo look different. So this will depend on your style and what you like. I don't like to do a ton of adjustments here. Maybe a little bit of temperature correction if I need it. I don't think this photo does, but if it was too warm, I could cool the photo. If it was too cool, I could warm the photo. I'm not going to do either. I'm just going to leave that as is. You can add vibrance to your photo to really bring those colors out, and you can also add saturation. Saturation is going to be heavier and affect more of the image. So I typically like to just adjust the vibrance and only touch the saturation if I need it. So I'm going to increase that just a little bit to bring a little more life into these colors, and that's probably good. Now, one thing you probably saw me skip over here is this curve. You can manipulate the curve, and this affects the lighting of your image, the shadows, the highlights, and you can use it to add contrast, to take it away, to lift the shadows, to make them pop. And there's lots of different ways you can do this. You can manually adjust the curve. If I put a little bit of an S curve in there, I can add some more contrast. And there are also some presets. All right, if I go to the presets, and in this case, I can go under the basic presets, and here you'll see there are some for the curve. I'm going to collapse this color. So I can have no curve. I could have a cross-processed curve, a flat curve, and you can see how that adjusts over here. This just flattens out my shadows and my highlights. I can lift the shadows by lifting that curve at the end, or I can have a strong S curve. So each of these options will affect the image and the lighting of it. Like I said, the highlights, the shadows in a different way. And you can see here how the different kinds of curves can totally change the style of your image. In this case, I'm not going to use any of the presets, and I'm just going to add a tiny, very minimal S curve on my own. You can see that's barely even noticeable, but that does add some contrast to this image. Now, I'm not going to adjust anything as far as my color mixer. You can change the hues. If I wanted these greens to be a little bit more yellow, I can do that or make them more green. If I wanted them to be more saturated or brighter or darker, and same goes for any color. If I really wanted to make that orange in the rock more saturated or brighter, I can adjust any of these colors individually. I can also click the picker and then click an area, and it will give me the color that I need, and then I can make the same adjustments. For this photo, I'm not going to adjust any of those. I'm going to leave it be. And same thing with these other options. If you wanted to use them, you can play around and see how they work. But to keep this simple, we're not going to touch these, and we're going to go straight to the next panel, which is the effects panel. Now, clarity can make an image seem a lot more clear, and so you might intuitively want to just up this. However, sometimes it can create a little bit of an unrealistic look, and a lot of our modern cameras are very clear and sharp anyway. So in some cases, I actually like to take this down just barely and then add more texture instead of clarity. And this will really help pull out some of the details in the finer areas of the image. If you see, kind of zoomed up on this bush, as I increase the texture, you can see the change that that's making there. Don't go too far on this, or it can look a little unnatural as well. But we'll just add a little bit of texture. And sometimes I don't even do this to the whole image. I'll just maybe do it to specific areas like the subject or what's close to the camera. And we can show that later. Now, dehaze, that will help to remove any of the haze in the sky and things like that. And if you move it the opposite way, you can add a little bit more of that haziness effect, which sometimes I like to do because that's more realistic to how we see it with our human eye. Things that are farther away look a little bit more washed out and less contrasty. And if I just increase that negative dehaze, you can see it kind of has that same effect and can help add depth to the image. All right, a vignette, if you decrease this, in other words, you go left, you can add that black vignetting around the frame. This can help draw attention to the subject It darkens those areas of the image, keeps the eye of the viewer looking at whatever it is in the center of the frame, and keeps them from going off of the image. But you can be too heavy with this, where it may end up looking strange. It can also make your sky look uneven, so you'll want to be careful. I'm just going to add a little bit of a vignette, nothing too intense. And I'll do some more with the masks later that you'll see. I'm not going to mess with grain. I don't really want to add any grain to this image, and I think it's good as is. So sharpening. If we want to sharpen our image, I would suggest, if you're on a Mac, holding Option and clicking on this masking. And now as I drag this, I can see what areas of the image will be affected. And I really don't want to sharpen everything. This would be too much, but maybe I just want to sharpen some of these finer details. So maybe something like this, and I can just increase that sharpening ever so slightly. You may or may not need to do this. In this case, this photo is already pretty sharp, so I probably didn't need to do that, but that's a good example of how you would do that. I would do this masking to see maybe if I had a subject like a person in my frame, if it was going to be sharp, I could get this to be just the person, then increase that sharpening and get that as sharp as we want. As far as denoising goes, there's not a ton of noise in this image. It's pretty sharp, but if there was, I could increase this a little bit if I needed to. There's also this kind of intuitive denoise feature. I'll typically skip this until the very, very end, and then I'll come back to it. And finally, we have these lens correction options. These were automatically selected for me, but if they weren't, you can go ahead and select them as long as your lens for whatever you were shooting on is in here. And these will help to fix some of the common lens issues, such as distortion or vignetting or chromatic aberrations, which you can get around branches. And this will adjust for whatever profile of the lens that you used to make sure that those are not brought into your image, which is really cool and really smart. Okay, now you'll see we're basically at the end of the panel. I'm going to expand this defringe one, and I don't think we have any chromatic aberrations really that I can see. They would show up as kind of purpley or green borders on things. There may be a little bit of pink on these, and we can see if that'll grab that, but it most likely won't. It looks to be very subtle. So if there was, you can click either the purple or green, select it, and remove those. And I'll show that in the second example. Okay, now that I've finished all of my global edits, I'm going to do all of my local adjustments. So I'm going to go to the masking, and let's just start with the sky. I'm going to select the sky, and let's bring the highlights down in the sky, maybe the exposure just a tad. All right. Increase some of the contrast. And for the sky, I'm actually going to add some negative dehaze just because I don't need it super sharp. And that's probably pretty good. Now, one thing I like to do is I'm going to grab a linear gradient and pull it from the bottom up. Move this. And I'm just going to darken the front of this frame. This helps to draw our eye in. It also helps to add more depth. Something not too crazy, pretty subtle, just like that. I think that will be good. Now, let's do a radial gradient. We're going to kind of try to make this tree pop a little bit more. And so these are all of my local adjustments. So I'm going to increase the exposure a little bit, the shadows. The whites can really make something like this pop, just bring out some of those brighter areas, and maybe even a tad bit of warmth. Okay, nothing too crazy. So here's without those masks that I just added, and with them, you can see the adjustments that made. One thing I want to do in this image in particular is I really want to darken up this shadow to create contrast, to emphasize those leading lines of the shadow to that tree. So I'm just going to do a brush mask. I'm going to change the size using the brackets on my keyboard. I'm just going to brush in what is basically that shadow. And now I'm just going to bring down the exposure. I don't want it to be too strong like that where it looks unnatural. But if I just bring it down a little bit, I can kind of emphasize that shadow. Perfect. I think something about there looks good. I don't think that there's really any other local edits I'm going to make to this image. I think this looks pretty good. And like I said, I try to keep things pretty minimal. So I'm going to go back to edit the whole image, maybe just increase that exposure a little bit, something like that. And now this is where I'd come down, I would do my denoise, and then my image would be ready to export. All right, now let's take a look at example 2. I'm going to go through my global edits first again, and then the local adjustments. I'm going to first change the profile to Adobe Landscape. And you can see that the sky is pretty blown out in this image. We'll do most of those adjustments specific to the sky in a mask, and we'll kind of ignore them for right now. I might try to bring them back a little bit with the highlights here. You can see it brings back some of that blue, and maybe even decrease the exposure a little bit, but I don't want to mess up too much of the rest of the image. I'm going to increase the shadows. There's lots of really dark areas in here. I want to make those pop a little bit more, and maybe even bring those highlights down more. All right, and let's see, I don't want to add too much contrast to this, so we'll just add a little bit. And something about there is probably good. Play around with the rest of these. If I increase the whites a little bit and maybe even increase the blacks just a tad to soften those. Okay, I'm going to leave the curve as is on this image and go straight to the color. This one I actually think could benefit from a little bit of color correction. You'll see this is the image as shot, and if I just warm it up a tad, it helps those colors to just look a little bit more warmer, which is how it looked to me in my natural eye when I was out taking this image. I don't need a ton more vibrance here because it was so bright. These colors are already pretty vibrant. You can see if I crank that up, that starts to look a little bit unnatural, but maybe we'll just increase it a tiny bit. Okay, now let's decrease the clarity a little bit of, I'm not going to touch the dehaze. Let's a little bit of texture, and let's add a vignette, something like that maybe. Okay, I don't want to do really probably any sharpening here. There's just so much in this image, so many leaves and branches, that if I over sharpen the image, it may start to look a little bit unnatural or confusing and odd. You can see if I were to just crank up that sharpness, kind of what that does. And so I'm going to leave that alone. We'll come back to noise reduction. Now, again with the lens correction, if I check this box, you can see that just moved my image a little bit. So what's happening is this lens profile that I shot with, this Canon EF-S 18-135 millimeter, does a little bit of distorting. And because that profile is in here, when I enable the correction, it fixes that distortion and improves my image. I'm also going to check remove chromatic aberration, which are going to be things like this. You can see those purples and greens fringing all around these branches. If I check this, that will help to remove most, if not all of them. But if there are any still left, you can see there's still quite a bit of purple, especially around these branches over here. What I can do is zoom in on them, find the problem areas like right here, and then go to this defringe. I'm going to select purple, click my eyedropper tool, identify it, click it, and now it's removed those. And that will help to make those branches and things like that just look so much more clear and crisp because we're not getting that fringing happening. Now, that's pretty much all as far as the global edits go. So let's move on to some of the local adjustments. In this case, I have a pretty complicated sky. I don't know how good the software will do at selecting it, but let's see how it does. I'm going to select the sky. Now I'm going to bring down the highlights a tiny bit, maybe the exposure, and I'm going to do a little bit of negative dehaze. I really don't want to do too much here. I think that's probably good, maybe even a little too much. That's probably good. Now, as you saw in example 1, I really like to kind of darken those frames of the image to help guide the eye in. So I'm just going to get a linear gradient here and darken up the front a little bit. Not too much, something like that maybe. And let's see, what else might we want to do? In this case, you can also brush and really use masks however you want. I like this tree right here on the right. I'm going to see if I can't make it stand out just a little bit more. So I'm going to put a mask over this, extend that out. And this is going to have to be pretty subtle because I don't want it to look something like that. But let's just increase the exposure slightly with shadows. Maybe even warm that area up a little bit because it is still a little too cool, I think. Okay, I think that's pretty good. So pretty subtle edits, and I think that's really how it should be. That will help your image to just look more natural and more like you saw it when you were out shooting. And then from there, again, I can end by denoising if I need to. There is some noise in this. I might add a little bit of denoise. You can see if I just increase this slightly, that I can soften that up, but I don't want to soften everything too much. And then it's ready to export. All right, for our third and final example, I wanted to show how you would do a merge. So in this case, I have 3 images that I took of a waterfall to create a panoramic. So one here of the far left, an image of the middle, and an image of the far right. I can select all of them by holding Shift, and then if I right click, I can do Photo Merge, Panorama Merge. There's different options for how you do the panorama. You can see here I have spherical, cylindrical, perspective. I would just click around and see what works best for your panorama. Most of the time it's going to be spherical. You can see here it did a pretty good job of stitching those together. I'm going to adjust that boundary warp just a little bit. I think somewhere about there is probably good. And then I'm going to do auto crop. I don't want to include any of that white space, and I'm going to hit merge. Now, once you've done that and while that merges, the rest of the editing is going to be just like any of your other images, and we're going to follow the same process. So now I have my merged panorama. I'm going to change the profile to Adobe Landscape and just go through our process. In this case, I think a little bit more exposure. We can adjust our highlights here a little bit, add some more contrast. I like that a lot. I don't have a ton of shadows here, and I think in this case, leaving them alone is probably fine. I am going to increase the white just barely for that water, and the blacks I'm going to increase a little bit too. All right, I think that's pretty good. Now let's move on. As far as color correction goes, I could make this warmer. I don't know that that would be right, or I could make it cooler. And that kind of has its own style as well. I think I'm more or less going to keep it as it was. And what I may end up doing, because the sun was setting and the lighting situation I was in, you can see the right of this is kind of warm and the left is a little bit cooler. So I may end up using masks to kind of even that out rather than just adjust the whole image together. All right, I'm going to increase the vibrance. I don't want to do it too much, something like that. And I do actually think I'll do the saturation as well on this image. Something about there. The rest of the colors I think we'll leave alone. I'm gonna probably just leave the clarity at 0, but add some texture, not too much. Something around there. If I do some negative dehaze, it does kind of bring out that mist, but I think it also gets rid of some of the clarity in the rocks and the waterfall. So I think we're just going to leave that slider alone for the most part, and maybe we'll do some masking. Let's add a tiny bit of a vignette. Something about there. Again, I'm going to hold Option and drag this masking to see what I would be sharpening. Maybe I'll just sharpen some of these borders and areas a little bit around the waterfalls. All right, and I always come back to denoise at the end. I'm going to enable that lens correction and remove the chromatic aberrations. Okay, now we can go ahead and do our masks. Let's start by doing that color correction I talked about. So I'm going to do a linear gradient and drag this across more or less here. I feel like is where that difference is happening, where it's warmer and then cooler. And let's just warm up that left side to match a little bit. I think that looks pretty good and natural. All right, now I'm going to grab another linear gradient, and I think I'm going to do 2 of these. I'm going to do one on the bottom and darken the bottom of the frame to kind of guide our eyes in towards those waterfalls. But I'm also going to do the same on the left because there's not much to look at over here on the left of the image. And we don't want the viewer's eye getting stuck there. So let me just add one somewhere around there and do a little bit of darkening that way as well. Probably just to about there. And I think that's good. The only other mask I think an adjustment I'll really make to this image is I'm going to use a brush and just brush over all of this mist and maybe add some negative dehaze to kind of bring out that mist a little bit. Something about there is probably good. Now let's go to the dehaze and just increase that a little bit. Okay. I think that looks really nice. All right, so I would just end this image by doing the denoise, which I won't click for now because you'll have to wait for it to happen. And that is example 3. Okay, now that we've finished our 3 photos, we're ready to export them. I'm going to come to the bottom, hit Shift and click to select all of my images. Then I can right click, go to Export 3 Photos, and I'm going to choose JPEG Large. You can also click Export and choose your own settings and put them in the folder where you want to save your images and hit Export. If these examples ended up being helpful to you, please consider checking out my book, Photography Simplified. If you would like a visual beginner's guide to photography, check out my book, Photography Simplified, available in both paperback and ebook format on Amazon. The book covers topics including exposure and the exposure triangle, sharpness and focus, gear, composition, editing, and more. It even includes a list of beginner tips. There are helpful graphics to explain each of the topics that are covered in the book. I've put a lot of work into this book to include everything I wish I could have known when I started out. If you think the book could be helpful to you and haven't already, check the link in the description for more information. Keep in mind when editing your photos that you don't want to over-edit your images. I personally don't like making them edited so far that it looks unrealistic or completely different than it looked to my eye. My goal is to improve and enhance the image while also staying true to how it felt and looked to my own eyes. Hopefully this video has been helpful for you. See ya in the next one.